firstly in terms of what she's just done. And so this is welcoming Satoko Kishimoto. She has for many years at TNI been a leader of global coordinated campaigning in defense of public services and for development of public services. She's a highly strategic thinker. She's been developing narratives in all these areas at a global level and for everyone to use at national level. And what she did earlier this year was respond to a request to stand as mayor for Suginami in Tokyo, in her own home country. And typically for Satoko, people say they were surprised, but many of us who know Satoko were not so surprised. She won. So it's with great pleasure that I'm going to give Satoko the floor, which I think will, let me try and okay, let me
Can I check my voice? Do you hear me?
Yeah, that's
cool.
perfect, Satoko. Thank you.
Wonderful.
I'm just trying to clear the
just to say that Satoko is spotlighted, so we can all hear and see Satoko in the main stage. Yes.
Okay. That's terrific. Carry on. Satoko, over to you. And we have half an hour of your time. Thank you very, very much. And big congratulations from all of us.
David, you said we have 30 minutes. I tried to speak 10 minutes.
Yeah, there will then be some questions and comments and discussion for sure.
All right. Okay, great. Well, very, very nice to meet you, all of you, and thank you so much for having me here. I'm Satoko Kishimoto at Transnational Institute. TNI is a TNI is a civil society partner of this very important conference. I worked for colleagues of PSIRU and IIPP. It turned out that I run the local election campaign for mayor in Tokyo, Suginami, last 3 months from April. I could not contribute much to preparing for this conference as I wanted. So that's my first apology, but my colleagues in TNI have kept working together, and that's today. Nevertheless, thank you so much for allowing me speak. Fortunately, and with surprise, I won the election. I will assume the office in 12 days. So I am still, I'm not mayor yet, and I'm still speaking as TNI researcher. So I'm speaking as TNI researcher and focus on shifting narratives in local politics in the backdrop of the ongoing privatization and austerity narrative in Japan. For more than 10 years, I have focused on remunicipalization in public services with many of you. With many of you, we have constantly collected deprivatization cases to build a concrete argument on how privatization, PPP, and outsourcing harm people and local economy and the planet, and to challenge persistent austerity policies, which has been discussed in this conference. In 2020, we made a global database on deprivatization with the University of Glasgow and many other partners, trade union partners, civil society partners. Now today, public futures, if you search on public futures, that database, global database, shows you 1,582 concrete cases documented in the world that to deprivatize, or you all know that once you privatize, to bring back to public ownership and management. 1,582 cases, 69 countries, and 96 diverse public services. Today, this database is available for the public information. So I think we believe that it has been really important resources for other countries like Japan, which is persistently promoting austerity policies and old-fashioned PPP. Old-fashioned PPP, I think Mariana Mazzucato will gonna to tell us, the public-private partnership could be different way. Public the forces can drive the industrial policies and public spending, rather than just sitting backside of the seat and all profit goes to private sector. So that's the old-fashioned PPP, which that's narrative is about. So we have been challenging to change narrative from different level, like it from local to global. So that's our collective work. I'm really happy, happy with our all collective work. Now I'm positioning myself to be responsible to the local politics. Just as a background, I tell you a bit about the place I am running as a mayor. Everybody knows Tokyo is huge. Tokyo has 14 million people, but I'm not governing Tokyo. So Tokyo has 23 special districts, special wards. So Suginami is one of the 23 special wards, and it has 570,000 inhabitants. So itself is quite like a big city in a way in European level. So I will be the first female mayor of Suginami City. Well, you also know that in Japan, the underrepresentation of women in politics is extreme. Not only national, the Congress and in society in general, like very strangely, the city mayors level. So Japan has 80,000 municipalities, and only 2% of those all municipalities run by the women, female mayor, which is quite extreme. So that's the bit background. I am elected completely against expectation, because the current mayor has been really typical, let's say typical the power politics and the vested interest, building vested interested mayor. Nobody believed a person like me from coming out from outside could win. So that's the backdrop. But that's not so important in this conference. Let's focus on the narrative, especially in my case, how local politics could influence or could make breakthrough to make a new narrative in public services and public spendings. In my election, actually our election, because this election was completely civil society driven, the collective election. So we are really inspired by the municipalist approach, not only Barcelona, but the many other cities, which, like the grassroots citizen really drive the election campaign itself. And they made policies collectively. I became a candidate by having agreement with the civil society election campaign. So I am just, as a candidate, but
Então, eu fui a candidata, mas na verdade é uma...
Is okay?
Yeah, it's okay.
Tá tudo bem?
All right. So it has been very inspired by the,
Ça a été très inspiré par
Sorry, can the interpreters be quiet, please?
Maybe
Satoko,
there's
carry
some.
on.
Okay, maybe some technical issues, I suppose.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay,
Parce que
good.
l'interprète a des problèmes techniques.
Yeah, but don't talk, please put it in the chat.
Mais ne prenez pas la parole.
Okay. Okay.
All right.
Envoyez votre message dans la boîte à dialogue.
Okay.
Apologies for some technical issues. I realized the interpreters are not assigned anymore, so that's why they came to the main channel. So
Apologies.
David as host will need to reassign them.
I will.
Yeah.
My apologies.
Do you think I can carry on?
You can.
Yes, please, Satoko, please carry on.
Okay. Thank you. Yes, yeah, I was talking about the kind of a citizen grassroots-driven the election campaign. They made up the policies, but that election campaign itself, I had only 2 months. So from that starting point, so I really have developed policies during the election campaign by listening to more the people, beyond the election campaign. That was really interesting challenge. Like the people come to talk to me, like the bringing we So the policy has been updated until the last day of the election day. So, but what we as a campaign called for, the main demand, the main promise is that recovering and reclaiming public services, centering climate justice, centering the care sector, and protecting and investing workers. We argued they all contribute to the revival of the local economy and to transit for decarbonized society. Increasing citizen political participation is overall demand. So it comes to shifting narratives. Well, I think you could imagine how dogma of privatization and the PPP has been extremely strong in Japan. For instance, if the municipality tried to make one kindergarten, public kindergarten, like Suginami, the city have to pay 100%. However, if the city make a private kindergarten, then the 90% of the money of the building, the office building, the kindergarten is subsidized by Tokyo government and national government. That has been extreme incentive to build private kindergarten, private daycare. So that's the situation. The Suginami, the city made 200 kindergarten, which is all private, and stopping the public kindergarten because that's cost money and workers they're fired. So that was the background. And Suginami is actually promoting, the privatization and also don't hire any new public workers. That's also typical way to, they press the public sector. That's not only kindergarten, daycare. It's all about the elderly cares, also the swimming pool, library, all any other, the public buildings for citizens. That's all about this policy continued the decades. So but it's actually, I really feel like before Corona, this reclaiming or recovering public sector, this message or this narrative didn't reach people, to be very difficult to reach people. But we felt this campaign really attracted people, particularly women, who are outside of the vested interest and also actually working in the care sector. Many are teachers, daycare staff, and also elderly care, the workers. They never involved politics, never get involved in election campaigns, but day by day they start coming to, you know, my speech, and we started, you know, like talking each other. I'm not speaking, you know, alone. We made a dialogue with the people who are not necessarily connected with parties nor any kind of political organizations. So this campaign was really getting more interesting day by day, because those people, especially women, have been very, very inspired. So I felt this is the change of narrative. Like people felt like recovering public sector is about us, you know, working very, very hard to you know, take care of children and elderly and people and the students. So they felt that's the issue of, you know, that's our issue, as a workers, but also the issue that the society's direction of the society. Luckily, local politics, I mean, local communities, we can imagine, you know, what is about about daycare, about, you know, child care, or elderly care, and the libraries. It's very imaginable, you know, places which has been eroded tremendously. So that's I really felt the Corona crisis. People start feeling, you know, this is about, you know, our life. But also, I really wanted to link, you know, the climate change issue. The public sector has a power, as we all know, you know, purchase power and a lot of, you know, the policy powers. So I really stressed, okay, you know, that the recovering public sector is not only talking about the public sector. We are talking about industrial policy. We are talking about local economy. So if, you know, the public sector spend money for workers and spend purchasing, for instance, food for school meals, and also spending money to the housing, particularly in Japan, as you know, earthquakes and the disaster is a real everyday, you know, like a threat. So I insisted, okay, this is not an individual responsibility to you know, the how do you call that, to make a wall thicker, to not to use CO2, not to use energy more. So, and also sorry, I don't really know in the English how to say that, to make a stronger building, not to against earthquakes. So those things are really real issue. So I said, okay, let's do it all together. You know, decarbonization, meaning like the housing has to be isolated, not to use CO2, but also against the earthquakes and also against burning. Those three things, you know, that's not individual responsibility. That's the public sector has to do, and those money goes to the local, you know, business. So, I mean, this makes sense for us, of course. That can be said community wealth building, as the democracy collaborative in Washington D.C. is advocating. So that's become really the people's issue. Like that's our issue, not only public sector but also local business. People felt, okay, that's good for us. So I think this is quite the key of the narrative change, in my view, of the success of the election campaign against you know, extreme austerity. The Suginami is worse. Oh my God! How in Corona time they made even more austerity because because of Corona, the economy goes down. Expected, you know, anticipated to go down. So then the income goes down. That's why the local authority did more austerity during Corona. That's incredible. So that was the reality in Suginami. So which has to be, of course, opposite. as we all know. And even that having austerity in any education and welfare, that's always austerity comes to those areas, not other areas. Still, the city government maintain very old-fashioned big road project, big development project, and having huge the development project having a huge buildings of we call tower mansion. That's something like 50 floors. The living the apartment, let's say luxury apartment, which they've driven which lead gentrification in the city. So that was the old narrative. So luckily people denied, people didn't like that narrative anymore because of also Corona. So I stop here. In terms of narrative change, just making sense. The people, even Tokyo, you have different image. Tokyo is not like Shinjuku and huge building. Here is real communities, and we don't have big buildings, the tall buildings. People love this city because this is a living resident city. So I really invite you, to come to Suginami, to welcome you, because I really want to make international cooperation with all progressive municipalist fearless cities. So I love to link, keep linking with you as a mayor, as a also activist. Continuously. Thank you so much.
Satoko, that's fantastic. Thank you so much. That's brilliant that you won the election. That's a brilliant account of how you did it as well. Very inspiring for us, precisely about narratives, precisely about linking it to local communities, which has happened elsewhere as well. Vera, would you like to come in with comment? Jenny?
Yeah. Can you hear me? Okay, good, because I had issues with my mic yesterday. Oh my God, Satoko, huge congratulations. Really, really amazing. I'm sitting here smiling all over. It's just really, really impressive. I just want to ask you two quick questions. One is when and how did you decide? What made you decide to become a mayor? And then what are you gonna do first? I really like to know. Congrats.
Yeah, that's a good and difficult question, because I didn't really plan at all, as you know, because I'm working for TNI, then working for this conference, and as you know, Future is a Public Conference 2022 in Chile, in Santiago. I have spent all my energy, with your, I think there are many colleagues here, and thought this is completely unexpected. So but I was asked to run, and I rejected because I'm not from local. I really insisted not to do, but I got to know issues, local issues of what I told you, like the road project, and like daycare center is closed down, and like the children care center closed down. I could not believe this is happening in 21st century in the city like Tokyo, because the local politics was completely top down. It's completely unreasonable. It's so little, the information disclosure. I think that's a reality in Japanese politics. So of course, there are many. I'm not only talking about Europe, but European, the municipalities, the standard is not standard for any other places. I know that, but I just cannot accept the situation like local community are so active, so mobilized, but they have to stop all plans one by one, bad plans one by one, because they have a good ideas and good, just because, kind of bad policies keep coming without any consultation or any information disclosure. I could not believe, I could not accept this situation, that if I can help something, I felt like I have to do, because we have worked together, on the, reclaiming public services. I felt that my expertise can be useful. So that's the reason. So what one want to do first is simple. It's very simple to make to make I want to make Suginami is a number one of information disclosure and political accountability. I mean, accountability of the local politics. So that's something, you know, it's possible, right? Because the disclosing information is, we don't lose anything. So it's a citizen can gain everything. So from that basis, you know, citizen can participate much more in the debate and the planning, and so that's my maybe first thing want to do, but to keep doing consistently for 4 years and further.
Aderonke, I don't know if you, sorry, Al Hassan, please come in.
Hi, Satoko, congratulations. And for me, the question now is, we keep talking about we need to support people to do this kind of things, and we reach out to people in office who don't share our ideas. Now we have Satoko in there. So I would turn the question around is, what is this group going to do to support Satoko to be successful in this role? Because if we have a successful story in Satoko's office, then we can use it legitimately to go in other places and encourage other comrades to also step up. There's a lot of potential within the network that we just need people to strategize and step up and support those who have gotten into office.
Right, thank you so much, Hassan. Well, the reality, like now I'm studying, is I really have to work. I mean, they have to. The city council is very hostile to me. I mean, the majority of the city council is against me, and also the bureaucrats, which there are 5,000 staff in Suginami. 5,000. They are all kind of, you know, like very surprised, you know, like with this completely unknown person who can be very radical, and people are so afraid of the staff people. So this is my reality. So that's why I really have to, you know, like to dialogue with people who didn't support me in the both councillors, but also the staff. So that's a serious challenge for me, because I have no experience in both, right? I only have experience in civil society to kind of collectively, you know, argue or advocate the policies. So my strength is imagination, you know, because I don't know the bureaucrats, nor politics as such. So, but they know that. So that's why my, you know, imagination and also connection of civil society should be seen and should be considered as strengths rather than threat. So this is my first challenge. But I think more important thing is citizen side. So they had an aim to, you know, to win the election. Okay, that's done. But now a huge challenge in front of them is to really create more autonomous, continuous civil society platform, like, you know, many, you know, the many cities in over the world is keep doing. Like they wanted to send next election, you know, like council election, they have to send good councillors for the election. But more, I think this is a challenge because the experience of citizen collective space to engage in local politics, like, you know, like observatory, or like, you know, the collective citizen collective research, or citizen collective training, or research and the planning, you know, those experience is, of course, you know, it's very new, isn't it? So how to make it the governance between, you know, citizen collective, the autonomous, you know, like organization, and the local, you know, administration and the local politics.
Okay.
I think that's a huge, I mean, interesting challenge to make kind of a, let's say, public community collaboration or public community partnerships. We are all talking about what is the governance, what is the finance, so what is the relationship between, you know, the political power and the institution and civil society, autonomous, you know, collective, the organizations. So that's going to be interesting challenge, and I love to learn. You know, this is one of the main work to how they make, you know, the public citizen collaboration in different issues in different areas. So that's, but this is, you know, now the citizen organization have to work seriously.
Okay. Satoko, thanks very much indeed. I'm going to have to wind up this session now because we need to move on to our next keynote speaker. But that was a wonderful, wonderful presentation from you, and very inspiring, and picked up on some of the things that other people have already been talking about this morning. Adironke was talking about the importance of working at community level with communities to clarify and identify what can be done and needs to be done, and you've done exactly that. So brilliant. We will both follow you and support you avidly over the coming weeks, months and years. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I will stay to listen to you.
Thanks very much indeed, Satoko. Okay, it's now my great pleasure to welcome Anis Chowdhury, who I hope has been spotlighted for everybody. Is that right, Jenny?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
Excellent. Anis, I'm going to give you a brief introduction because you deserve a significant introduction. Anis is
Don't embarrass.
Professor of Economics at Western Sydney University, which is a big understatement. I don't know where all the noise is coming from, but it's not here. For many years before that, he worked as economist for UN agencies, including UN ESCAP and UN DESA. But for the last 30 years, from our perspective, one of the most important things is he's been one of the few academic voices consistently insisting on the possibility and necessity for more progressive macroeconomic policies. And he remains a consistent commentator on current global economic issues, including climate change, the impact of economic sanctions, and just have a look at the IPS blogs if you want to see Anis's wisdom. He's going to be talking to us today about a new report on economic recovery from COVID, which he's also launching today. Anis, thank you so much for agreeing to speak to us. So over to you now, and please share your screen, and we will listen with great interest to your presentation. Thank you.
Thanks for actually having me, and for this very interesting changing the narratives. I hope you can see my slides there. And I'm not very good in technology, unfortunately. Sorry, yeah. I was actually thinking to join a bit earlier, but something urgent happened. A neighbor of mine not well, and then I had to organize the things. He's in the hospital. So anyway, so yeah, so I was a bit caught up and calling another friend to hand over the responsibility to him, etc. Anyway, so thanks for having me in these discussions, very illuminating. The paper I did actually for PSI, responding to the ILO resolution that was passed last year, 109th ILO, the General Conference or something like that. So, and it calls for inclusive job recovery, etc. So you can understand the UN kind of language, everything in there. And it has got 4 pillars to achieve this. And one of the pillars, it has the number 1 is the inclusive growth. supportive policies for inclusive growth, supportive macroeconomic policies, and industry policy to be exact. So it's a supportive macroeconomic and industry policy for a broad-based job recovery. So today I'm not going to touch on the industry policy. Maybe it will come as if I have time as an appendix kind of thing. But my main focus would be the macroeconomic policy in the context of unequal impacts of pandemic. Pandemic did not affect everyone the same way. The more vulnerables were disproportionately affected, we all know, while the ones who has the skill to work from home and had the money to go to the space, they did all the enjoyment. What is the noise coming from? Yeah, maybe one of the participants' microphone is because there are nearly 100 participants. So one of the participants probably has his or her microphone on. So if everyone can mute, that would help. Okay. And then scarring effects of the pandemic remains, and what we call is K-shaped recovery within the country and between the countries happening. Some countries which had the privilege of having the vaccines pre-purchased few times more than what they needed. They could have 4th or 5th doses of vaccine, while many did not have or could not have even a single dose as yet. Then now with the supply bottlenecks happening, exacerbated by war and conflict, sanctions. Some commotion going somewhere. So inflation is a new phenomenon, and then there is a stagflation fear. In this context, what can macro policy do, and or is there any role for the macro policy? We need to actually shift from the dominant paradigm. The dominant paradigm since the 1980s has been, well, actually earlier than then, but 80s could be you can easily say it is from 80s, focused on debt, deficit, and inflation. So these are the three focus of the macro policies, and then everything else, growth, inclusive growth, decent employment, equity, grid structural transformation would follow. So it's kind of a trickle down. How about this did not happen? Very interesting, actually. World Bank has done a review of the experience of the 1990s. I forgot the exact title. It's really interesting that I would actually suggest, if I have time, I can get the exact title of that publication. It's a scathing indictment about what happened, all this, the lost decades of development. Two decades of lost decades of development. Ironically, some of the big names, I'm not going to name the names here because people might think, no, I'm just bashing people. No. And big names trying to explain, for example, why there was a lost decades of development in Africa. It was one said that it is difficult geography and nothing to do with the policy that was imposed on them as part of a structural adjustment. And some said it is due to the difficult ethnicity, which has a propensity to go into conflict. And as some others said, it is the curse of the resource curse. So again, blaming the victims. And if despite all the plunders of the resources from Africa, Africa is still a resourceful country. You can't change it. Africa ethnicity, you cannot change. Africa geography, you cannot change. Then it means Africa is doomed forever. So that is the implication of our new liberal friends. So all sorts of things happen, and so we need to move on from this paradigm. So the myth that have been entrenched. One is government debt causes macroeconomic instability. The diagram that you see, I have taken this diagram from Fiscal Monitor, May 2010. Fiscal Monitor 2010 from IMF. The background paper for the Fiscal Monitor. This is the publication based on which in 2010 IMF recommended austerity from the stimulus packages that were in place in response to 2008-2009 GFC. So, but if you look at this scatter plot, on the horizontal axis is the initial gross debt as a percentage of GDP, and on the vertical axis, some measure of macroeconomic instability by looking at the variability of nominal GDP. Actually, there is no relationship. They have fitted a line. You can see there is the vertical line. I imposed it to differentiate, but the original diagram doesn't have that vertical line. It has got that horizontal line. It is a flat relationship. There's virtually no relationship. And yet they say if the debt increases, macroeconomic instability will increase and you will have trouble. And anyway, so this was the myth. And then the vertical line I put there because if you see that even when the debt to GDP ratio is exceeding 100 here, you can you see my cursor when I move the cursor? No. Can people see the cursor?
Yes,
yeah.
That's visible.
So this 100, you can see, I put it here. In that, if you leave this as outliers, some of these, in this region, there is no relationship until even more than 100%. And the other thing that this debt does not differentiate whether it's a domestic debt or external debt. So they lump together everything into this debt thing. And we all know there is a qualitative difference, fundamental difference between domestic debt and external debt. The second myth, fiscal deficit is bad for growth. Now again, I plotted, this is my plot. I mean, this is, I plotted this, more than 100 countries, data taken from 1990 to 2020 data. And I took the average of these countries, and because otherwise it would be too many dots. And you can see even when the deficit is say about 10% of GDP, within that circle, you can see there is virtually no relationship. Virtually no relationship. Okay. So what is the thing? The 60% debt and 3% fiscal deficits were determined arbitrarily. Now, the 60% debt limit of the EU comes from when their Maastricht Treaty was signed. That was the median debt to GDP ratio in the EU countries, and especially the bigger ones. So, so they took it as from the, it's a matter of convenience, accept that as the limit. But then, over in no time, it became as if a sacrosanct optimal debt to GDP ratio. Now, I find this extraordinary for economists to believe in arbitrary figures and then try to justify it, going backward kind of thing, proving it is not optimal, with all sorts of complicated mathematics, which is still they could not prove that is optimal. Similarly, 3% budget deficit came exactly the same way. Now, IMF has done some work on the developing countries' debt to GDP ratio, and they put it as 40%. But in the same paper, in the same document, IMF says debt ratio above 40% of GDP by no means implies a crisis. If it does not imply a crisis, why should you put 40% as the limit? In the same paper, if you know, in the same document, it says that, and they're interesting. And now, having published the 2010 fiscal monitor, which came under very, all this data fudging became evident. Then IMF in 2012, the World Economic Outlook made the admission that the 2010 recommendation came from back of the envelope calculation. This is criminal, I think. No, you say you suggest policies based on back of the envelope calculations, which affects millions of lives. Then they say there's no simple relationship between debt and growth, no single threshold for debt ratios that can delineate the bad from the good. This is the exact quotation from 2012 World Economic Outlook. But prior to that, in 2001, World Bank did very extensive research on debt and GDP and growth, and then came to this conclusion again in quotation, no unique set of thresholds for macroeconomic variables between stability and instability. So still these things dominate the discussions, and policymakers are somehow stuck to these limits. Now, there are new liberals' objections to fiscal activism. They have various arguments. Interestingly, they are throwing all these arguments, hoping that something will stick. And these arguments are all contradictory. So if one doesn't happen, the other will happen, but none can happen at the same time. So, because they are contradictory. But they're hoping that something will stick. One is crowding out. How does the crowding out affect? When government spends, there is an increase in, initially there will be some increase in income, and that income increases the demand for money. When money supply is fixed, this is a standard ISLM model which Hicks regretted. Even after Hicks disowned his own ISLM model, we still keep using it. And so interest rate will rise. When interest rate will rise, then there will be there will be decline in private investment, so crowding out. Crowding out can happen also through balance of payment, because when this demand, it will be inflationary, it means then you have a real appreciation of your exchange rate, and as a result, you have a balance of payment crisis. So you have crowding out through that because your export will decline. So demand will decline. Regarding equivalence is that every time government goes into deficit, then the private sector, rational economic agents will reduce their demand, their expenditure, because they think there will be future increase in taxes to pay the. Now, if Ricardian equivalence happens, then there is no increase in demand, net increase. So why should crowding out happen? Why should balance of payment a crisis should happen? So if Ricardian equivalence, then the second thing, crowding out happens when under the assumption that money supply is fixed. And there are also many other factors that determines investment behavior, not just interest rate. If the government spends on productivity enhancing activities, like good infrastructure, skilled workforce, so on, the investment should, in fact, there should be crowding in rather than crowding out. So all these contradiction, and then when government spends, how does the government spend? Government writes a check, for example, and pays to me, to anyone else who is doing business with the government. Government pays in check, not cash. And check is paid to from the central bank to my bank, wherever my account is, as my business account is. So the moment my bank receives that check, government check, is reserves goes up, is cash increases, and be over and above the legal reserve requirement. So that enhances commercial banks' ability to create more credit. So it's an endogenous money I'm bringing in. So every time government spends, money supply basically increases because money supply is not just the money that is being printed from the mint or by the central bank. Money supply is also is influenced by the credit creation by the commercial banks. So interest rates should actually decline. So with all this contradiction, it is not surprising that extensive research by IMF, you don't get these things. They don't do this research anymore. It was done in the 20 years ago now. There is little evidence. This is a quote from IMF. Little evidence of direct crowding out or crowding out through interest rate and exchange rate, nor does full recurring equivalence or a significant partial offset. Forget the full, even not a partial, get much support from the evidence. So I don't know who is saying this, but it is from the IMF. I actually, in different seminars, I ran some kind of a quiz. I did not put the source. I quoted this and asked people from where this quote could come. Nobody said it could come from IMF or World Bank. They thought it was some radical lefty authors or something like that. Okay, so this is the situation we are confronting. So the evidence is on our side. Now then, we have this another two arguments which I could not fit in the other. Inflationary, the government expenditure will cause inflation, and there will be real wage resistance. Now, this is a very interesting debate. These two debates happen not new. It happened in the 50s, early 50s, in the context of Indian national planning. Between the economists at that time and the people who believed in this, they won the debate. The inflationary argument comes like this way. The developing countries, because of structural rigidities, supply rigidities, even though there are huge unemployment or unused capacity, because of the rigidity, they operate as if they are in full employment. So that is the assumption. So as if they are in full employment. So any government expenditure will end up in inflation, not in the increase in employment or output. So that was the argument against fiscal activism that was entrenched within the Indian Planning Commission in the 1950s. What is real wage resistance? This is the argument that came from the father of Partha Dasgupta, Umiya Dasgupta, who was known to be a very famous economist. He was known to be the Milton Friedman of India. I have to say this because ideas are very similar between these two. Now, he argued that the real wage in the developing countries is already at a very subsistence level, and it cannot go down any further, which is sensible. So every time there is a fiscal activism, this is how the transmission happens. There will be increase in price. and price increase means real wage will go down. And where real wage goes down, employment increases. This is the Keynesian transmission mechanism of fiscal policy onto the employment. I repeat, it's a very standard 101 economics. When government expenditure increases due to increased demand, price will increase. The price increase means the real wage will go down, and when real wage goes down, employment increases. But in the context of very low subsistence real wage cannot go down any further. So every time that happens, you have to adjust the nominal wage to keep the real wage at least at the subsistence level, which is very similar to that so-called rational expectation hypothesis, that every time inflation rises, there will be demand for even forward demand, not just backward demand. In anticipation of inflation, they will be asking for higher wages. So basically, real wage will remain fixed and nothing can happen. Now, what are the evidence? Evidence is various, now recent evidence, we have not seen inflationary pressure coming from all the stimulus we saw during the COVID time. Now, the inflation that happened, this is almost consensus is there that by and large, I mean, about a month ago, the governor of the Central Bank of England said that 80% of this inflation is not demand related, and we don't have any control over it. Yet we have to raise interest rate, 80%. And same said same was the opinion of the Fed chairman. So it is due to supply disruption by and large. And it ignores, this kind of argument ignores where money is spent. Government borrows, obviously, and it spends. And where is this spent? If fiscal expenditure is for productivity enhancing, skill and capital formation, then supply bottlenecks will be relaxed and there should be no inflation. And then also the point that all these things happen, fiscal policy comes because the private demand is falling short to fill that gap. So again, there's no net increase in the demand. And what we have seen also evidence, real wage either has been falling or stagnant, and labor income share in GDP has been falling since the 1980s. So the evidence is not in saying that what the claim is. The next the myth is the inflation harms growth. Now this is the diagram I did, the scatter plot, again using the data from 1990s to the 2020. And it's about 180 plus countries again. And I find a similar picture as Bruno and Sterling found when they were working for the World Bank. Bruno was the chief economist of the World Bank. Sterling was a senior economist there. And they did a paper and asking the question, is inflation harmful to growth? And after doing a lot of iteration, they found the ratio of fervent beliefs to tangible evidence seems unusually high. So this is entirely a belief. I remember as an undergraduate student, when I was undergraduate student reading Ferguson's Intermediate Microeconomics, in the preface, he claimed New Classical Economics is an article of faith. He was honest, at least, admitting that. And later editions removed that statement. So if you have the earlier edition of Ferguson, not Ferguson and Morris, Ferguson, solo Ferguson, the later editions were by Morris, and he removed that statement by Ferguson that New Classical Economics is an article of faith. Okay, so there is no theoretical thing. And then this is a bit interesting. Inflation harms poor. Inflation obviously harms poor, But what kind of inflation? Not the general price level increase, because but what affects the poor is the prices of essentials, food, transport, your basic services. And those are the things that affect, not the general inflation CPI that the figure you see, because in fact, it should help the poor who are the net debtor. Lower inflation helps the creditors because the real value of credit goes up and real value of debt also goes up. When inflation is high, then real value of what is called the credit goes down, and that I got mixed up. When inflation is low, real value of debt goes up. Yeah. So and when inflation is high, real value of debt goes down, and because the poor are net debtor, that helps the poor in some sense. 2% inflation target, which has become an international norm. How did we get the 2%? I mentioned about how we got the debt limits. Now I'll show you how we got the 2%. The figure was plucked out of the air. This is the statement from Don Brash, who was the governor of Reserve Bank of New Zealand, which first adopted 2% as an inflation. But how did he get the 2%? It was a chance remark by the New Zealand finance minister on a television interview. He just mentioned, it came out of his mouth, and then it became a mantra repeated endlessly. Again, in quotation mark from Don Brash's memoir, and now an international norm. I mean, it's extraordinary. Understanding inflation. Inflation is not an ailment, it is a symptom, and we call it overheating. It's just like a fever, you can say, and there can be many causes of this fever. And as I said, the current inflationary surge is due to supply shortages of key products such as food and fuel. Therefore, the long-term solution would require expansion of supply and fiscal measures for cost of living support. Interest is a blunt. Now, every central bank is using interest rate, raising interest rate. It is a blunt, indiscriminate tool. It cannot differentiate the sectors which are experiencing shortages and so needs expansion. So we need to actually provide them cheap loan, cheap credit, so that they they can expand, and will adversely the higher interest rate or interest hikes will adversely impact the investment in those sectors. Interest rate is like chemotherapy. You need to kill cancerous cells, but it will also kill good cells. Now, this is the quotation I took from 1956 UN report, which was led by Michael Kelesky. A single economic policy seems no more likely to overcome all sources of imbalance which produce rising prices and wages than is a single medicine likely to cure all diseases which produce a fever. So what do we need? We have this central bank independence running this policy, which are causing so much stress for the low income people for the workers. And he never liked central bank independence. He says money is too important to be left to the central bankers. And he also says, is it tolerable in a democracy to have so much power centralized in a body free from any direct political control? And he also says almost invariably involves dispersal of responsibility dependent on personalities, who is the governor of the central bank, and always emphasize the point of view of bankers. And then he says the defects constitute a strong technical argument against an independent central bank. This is Milton.
Alice, sorry, can I just chip in here? We have about 5 minutes left.
I'll be quick.
Move on to some of the policy points.
Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, and okay. Policy innovation. Central banks should ignore changes in the price of things that they cannot control, and we need real sector policy, which is ease financing of desired industries, tighten credit for those the speculative one. We need to use more of input-output information, flow of funds information, to know which sector is in bottlenecks, needs support. We also need to know who is saving, who is not saving, who is in. So that's why we need flow of funds, and there should be prudential regulations of capital flows and anti-monopoly regulations. And we don't need class war to address inflation, because what they say, well, we have to be to increase the credibility of the central banks, and they agree that 80% of the inflation currently is not due to demand factors, but in case the workers ask for higher wages, the second round effect. So we have to create a fear among the workers that, look, if you ask for higher wages because there's inflation rising, we are going to hit you. So basically, that is what it is, a class war. That you have to anchor your inflation expectation to forward-looking the measures, kind of thing. And we don't need that. So social dialogue can workers understand what is causing inflation. Anyway, so policies, we need the job retention measures, we need job stimulation, cost of living support. These are all come from the fiscal side. So you need to support the monetary policy with the fiscal policy. And there has to be a high degree of coordination between fiscal and monetary policy. What happened with the quantitative easing? There was no coordination between the fiscal authority and so-called independent central banks. The central bank went ahead and did things, increased the credit, which went into speculative activities instead of productive activities. And the central banks bought bonds from the dying industries, the zombie industries, allowed the zombie industry to survive in that way. So it created more vulnerability and sometimes too big to fail kind of situation. And we have. So we need policy reforms, reform the central bank purpose, borrowing for public sector investment. I must say here, the borrowing from the central bank or domestic borrowing is different from borrowing overseas. So there should not be much limit from borrowing from domestic source. If the economy needs to know all this kind of, because if you, especially for the developing countries, their fiscal space is very, very low, and they cannot raise taxes regardless how much reform they do to the taxation system, because of the informality of the economy and the low level of income means tax to GDP ratio will be low by definition. So they need to be able to borrow domestically. If there is any problem with the balance of payment, you can apply some kind of restriction on luxury imports, for example. The workers increase in income of the low income people do not spill over to balance of payment. And you need institutional reforms. As I said, you need to revisit central bank independence, so-called fiscal rules, and we of course have to be careful about misuse of fiscal funds. So we need democratic oversight. We need stakeholders to get involved in this business. So what we call participatory budgeting and oversight. So the independent media, these are very important for the accountability. And that affects also the central bank. The governing body should be balanced, not just representing the business and the financial sector. So these policy reforms imperative comes from the UN Charter because it mentions your full employment. the IMF's article of association, article number 4, also talks about maximum employment, reasonable with reasonable price stability, and of course we have the ILO declaration. So all these maintain full employment as a human rights, and it's consistent with the functions and responsibility of democratic state. Thank you. Okay.
Anis, thank you so much. That was a real tour de force in that space of time. You've demolished a whole series of those myths that have supposedly been underpinning neoliberal policy, offering in their own terms. It's quite extraordinary that the policies should continue when they're so lacking in evidence base, and so that itself was very useful, and that was a very clear, succinct summary of the key pillars of progressive policy to enable proper recovery and sustainable development. We don't have time for discussion of it, I'm afraid, but I hope you'll be willing to share your presentation with the through the conference, and of course we'll point people to the link to your new report as well. So thank you very much indeed for doing that. That's been a great.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and I'll be here in case there is any questions coming in the chat and things like that. I'll be happy to respond. Yeah. Excellent, excellent. Then in that case, please everybody take up Anis's encouragement to raise questions and issues in the chat. And now I'm very pleased for a lot of reasons that we're going to be listening to Alicia Bárcena for a lot of reasons, because we feared up until about 2 days ago that we were not going to be able to listen to Alicia Bárcena, but she got in touch with us and very kindly offered to contribute. So we're very, very pleased about that. Thank you. Alicia was Director, Executive Secretary, I think is the term, of UN ECLAC for about 14 years. And before that, she worked on sustainable development in Latin America for UNDP as well. She has been in that role a consistent advocate of progressive macroeconomic policies, and especially the important role to be played by the public sector. And she was doing that right up until the moment of her retirement, which was 3 months ago. We're very pleased that I don't know if this is your first appearance since your retirement, but we're particularly grateful that you've agreed to appear since you are retired. I just want to add one other extraordinary thing, which I think probably makes unique in the whole world, that Alicia has a number of degrees, but the core ones are, she started with a degree in biology from UNAM in Mexico. She moved on to get a master's in public administration from Harvard, and she's subsequently, in the course of her work, received an honorary PhD from the University of Havana in Cuba, among other universities. I suspect there's nobody else in the world who has that triple combination of degrees. So congratulations on that too, Alicia. And please, over to you now. We look very much forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you. Please share your screen when you're ready. Would you,
Mute. Yes, now I am mute.
Okay.
Thank you very much. I'm very, very pleased to be here today and to share with you more from a practitioner point of view what I think is so essential for a region, especially like ours in Latin America and the Caribbean. And first of all, David, to thank you so much for the openness for me to speak. And of course, I'm going to do it in I hope in the time I've been allocated. And as I said before, let me do it from the perspective of a practitioner. And where do we want to go with public policy? I think this is what I think we should be thinking about. I think Chowdhury very excellently presented to us the theories and how, as he said very well, the World Bank, the IMF, the neoliberal policies have drawn us to certain public policies that are so contrary to what we need actually, especially in developing countries, of course, but I think all over the world. So as you said, let me share my screen. Just tell me if you can see it, please. And let me see if I can put it in full. Can you see that?
We can see it.
Okay.
And now
so,
yep.
Very good. Thank you. Well, if we are in shifting narratives, one of the narratives we need really is where do we want to go with public policies and with the expenditures that we have available? First of all, there is an urgent need for a welfare state and for a care society, a society that cares not only for the people, but for the planet. And the pandemics was very harsh in showing us how much we need to move to a care society and how much we need to move to a big push for sustainability. And the problem is that the whole macroeconomic structure and the whole science that we are receiving today with high inflation, with less fiscal space, with high debt, is moving us away from this. And but definitely we cannot give up to have a welfare state and a care society. And of course, we have to address, and from ECLAC we have been advocates of this, is the structural challenges that reproduce the gaps in terms of inequality, gender, and generation, territory, ethnicity. And definitely we need to move towards a new pattern of development that is really focusing on equality and sustainability. And what we're talking about here is that we need social protection systems that are universal, comprehensive, resilient, and sustainable. And that has to be, I would say, guaranteeing at least jobs, and I think Chowdhury said it very well, employment, but employment with rights, not any employment, food, and of course, and security. But the pandemic showed us that we have many gaps on healthcare, education, and of course on quality, on basic services. And this is what we call public good. I mean, there has been an absence of public goods. And one of them, of course, is water, for example. And only, I mean, potable water and sanitation is something that we've learned very hard, in the hard way, that we were missing very, very much in many people in our region, by the way. Then, of course, we have to focus on labor inclusion. I mean, that's another of the things that we need to really look into. As I would say, labor was one of the most hit areas in the pandemics. And of course, it hit much more women and young people. And in our region, we don't have unemployment insurance, for example, or we don't have care infrastructure. So these are things where the public expenditure should be really focusing on. So anyway, but we definitely need a transition to patterns of consumption and production that have greater cohesion and care for the environment. But all of this costs money, of course. So what are the challenges of a new role of the state? And in our case, in Latin America and the Caribbean, but I think this is also true, for example, for Africa, is what are the areas of production? What is the evidence that we have in front of us? So we have challenges in terms of production. First of all, we have an external gap, asymmetries in many ways, and the global asymmetries are growing, as we will see later. And the global asymmetries between the developed world and the developing countries is growing and growing and growing, not only in technological capabilities, but in every front. And then we also have an internal gap productivity differences between sectors, firms, and within countries in a region like ours. And we believe very much that without the active participation of the state, the production model that we have, which is a production model that is based on investing on extractive industries and producing raw materials for exports, and these exports or raw materials are being processed in the developed world. This is what Prevish called the center periphery syndrome, and this is we are there, and we have not been able to improve, and the production. The productivity in Latin America compared with that of the United States is growing even wider. And we see that Latin America and the Caribbean is just not moving from this productivity measured, of course, by percentages of industrial GDP. And we can see that the engineering intensive sectors in our region are simply not moving fast enough. And we are more concentrated on resource-intensive sectors and labor-intensive sectors. So the challenges then are, how do we link the productivity sectors with those that are already in the frontier? And this is what we call heterogeneity in productivity. And we call that the centerpiece of inequality, because we have agents that are very close to the technological frontier, but we also have small and medium-sized companies that are the ones who are creating jobs, but basically informal jobs without formality in terms of rights, without social protection. And the other thing we have seen is that science and technology in our region is really losing. And I think that what we need, and I hope the wave of progressive governments that are coming into our region in Colombia, in Mexico, in Argentina, and hopefully in Brazil, in Bolivia, that explicit industrial policies will be clear, because many governments have established that we don't need industrial policy, the market take care of it. And this is practically one of the legacies of the neoliberal model. So we definitely need an explicit industrial policy, but attached to a development banking to promote innovation, but a development banking that is not pro-cyclical as they are today, but really counter-cyclical. A development banking that can engage, for example, now where we have so many problems in the world, but in this region, high debt, we have very, the shrinking of the policy of the fiscal space. So that's when the development banking is needed. And it's needed really to finance, for example, the small and medium-sized companies, linking them to a more dynamic sectors. So this is part of the problems we see. And the challenges we see ahead is how to strengthen proactive industrial policies. Even now, you see, and industrial policies that are attached to sustainable development. I mean, to decarbonize the economy, industrial policies that are linked to renewable energies, I would say to efficient uses of water. As you know, with Mariana Mazzucato and Ngozi Iweala, we are participating with the chairmanship of these two wonderful women. We are participating in a commission that is called Water for the Common Good. And I think this is essential. We need really to have these proactive sustainable development policies, but also we need to discipline private recipients of grants, because, and this has to be done to be able to transform the production fabric. And we need to promote public investment. Public investment and private investment in our region is the lowest in the last 3 decades. It's not a result of the pandemics. 3 decades of very low public and private investment, because investment has been, I would say, the losing factor whenever there is a contractive fiscal policy. Now public and private investment in our region is 19% compared to the 26%, which is the average of the world in public and private investment, and 32%, which is the number for emerging economies. So our region is really very lagging behind on this. And we also need to come back to state ownership on main exportable natural resources. This is a very controversial point, but we really need to do this because there are some key sectors in our region that should also be for the common good. And at least the profit should go for creating, I would say, public goods and for decarbonizing the economy, for example, and even let's say the levy taxes or royalties in mining activities should be attached to environmental sustainability. This has been very controversial and very difficult here in Chile. The new government of Boris is promoting this, and of course he's facing a lot of problems in relation to the private sector. And of course there are challenges related to labor, and we have learned that in our region we have decades of poor labor market performance, and the pandemics only put this in a very difficult, even in a worse situation. We have high rates of unemployment, segmentation, and precariousness, and that is the jobs that were more affected by the pandemics were precisely the more precarious jobs, because we have high levels of informality and very low income. So we need to strengthen the labor institutions and make sure that they are inefficient and that and they prove to be even more favorable for young people and women. So we feel that the challenges of the new role for the state in the social sphere, and the evidence we have is that we definitely need to understand that our region is the most unequal region of the world, not the poorest, is the most unequal. Where and how do we focus on this? Not only on the poverty side, but also on the wealthy side, and we need to put together instruments to make sure that the redistribution is happening. And this is called fiscal reform. But what happens today is, due to the pandemics, nobody wants to talk about fiscal reform, much less the IMF or the World Bank. And they are only, putting forward palliatives and, let's say, only measures that go to high vulnerable households or etc. So we need to move into a social spending that is much more progressive. And the other thing is that we are confronting a lost generation in terms of education. And I think this is something that is very hard. So income distribution in our region we have already decades of without progress on income distribution. And the only way to face this is by creating, of course, jobs, by going for more productive sectors, but indeed with a fiscal policy. And so we need to redirect, we have to make a direct redistribution of income through non-contributory systems. This is what some states have done, no question about it, but this is not sustainable in time. We need to have solidarity-based health insurance. And of course, education, we have to invest on education as a public good, because today education in many countries of our region is a private good, and not everybody has really access to this. So of course, during the pandemics, the role of the state, there were 7 proposals that have been applied: non-contributory transfers to families, transfer to elder people, transfers to unemployed, and also for the care of early childhood education. Not enough and temporary. Unfortunately, these measures were applied only in 2020. Half of them, half of the expenditure in 2021, and now 2022, none. And they are dismantling all this help that was done at some point. So bottom line, we need state policies that change the production structure through macroeconomic, horizontal and sectoral policies, and fiscal and credit incentives. I think Chowdhury made a very good point about where we are in terms of fiscal policies and why are we following the neoliberal school, in which what's happening today is that all the central banks are increasing the interest rates as if it was the single only tool. And as he very rightly said, why are the central banks operating the way they are, instead of responding to the needs of their own people and countries, they are responding to the, I don't know, well, the international community, more linked to the financial institutions. So there is something there, because at the end of the day, the increase of interest rates is responding to the demand side of inflation, but not to the supply side. So we really need to focus also on the supply side of inflation and try to see how much we can become more self-sufficient in some sectors with productivity and more jobs. And I think our region stands ready, could be ready, if politics works, to be more self-sufficient in health, more self-sufficient in food production. We are superavitarian in terms of food production. Now, of course, in the provision of public goods with a universal view. So we believe that a fiscal covenant is a sine qua non. And of course, this is a very challenging time to do this. But there is sufficient scope to promote the redistributive role of the state, to increase the social expenditure, and most importantly, the collection of revenues to finance it. And that is to change the tax structure, which today is very regressive, because those who gain more are paying less, by the way. Secondly, we have a tremendous amount of tax avoidance, which is up to 6.3% of GDP annually. We're talking around $360 billion that are going out of our region. And where are they going? This is where we need a fiscal covenant that is not only national, but it has to be international. And as I said before, we have growing asymmetries between developed and developing countries. There are things that our countries can do on their own, but there are many things that we need to change at the global level. Indeed, the state played a very important role in the crisis, in the pandemics, but they are dismantling it right now. And we are pushing for the state to continue coordinating fiscal, monetary, social, and environmental policies. But what we are worried more than anything is that now the recovery is following the previous model. The extractive industries are coming back. The fossil fuels are coming back. Everybody's now, because of the crisis between Ukraine and Russia, everybody's going back to the production of oil in the traditional way, exploiting everything. So where are we in terms of these moving towards decarbonization? I think we are in a very weakened multilateralism that is taking us to nationalism and regionalism. And as I said before, in our region, these are the numbers of how much tax evasion is I mean, what we have in our region and in many regions is a culture of privilege, a culture of the elites, a culture that is always dominated by the elites. And one of the expressions of the culture of privilege is precisely tax evasion, avoidance, and exemptions. And this is where we think we should go. We should really review, first of all, tax evasion should be combated at all, but we need the international community to do this. We need to review the tax expenditures, because these are the privileges that are given to some sectors for them to produce, like incentives, but at the end of the day, they are privileges. In the country I am, the privileges, the tax expenditures amount 2.9% of GDP, which is urgently needed for other social purposes or even productive purposes. And we need to strengthen personal and corporate income taxes, to expand the scope of wealth and property taxes, taxes on digital economy, but not on the consumers, but really on the big, large companies, and also to review the royalties for the exploitation of renewable resources. When we compare our region with OECD, you can see here the differences. In income is almost half, in property is almost half, but where are we doing a good job, let's say, is precisely on the VAT, that is on the indirect taxes that are hurting more the people than anything else. So we need tax systems that really, are very badly designed, are regressive. They have a low tax burden, high levels of evasion, as I said, And then the social spending has very little redistributed impact. So we need to move into a more, I would say, redistributed processes. And of course, insufficient investment. I think this is the key in infrastructure, in science, in innovation, in developing banking, and in environment. I think these are the things that we need to put a lot of emphasis. And as I said before, I think in our region, we have two very, very key priorities, health and education. We lost 56 weeks in terms of full participation of students, or full or partial closures. Normally a year is 40 weeks, and we lost 56. And we have the risk of school dropout. And I think this is something that our region needs to focus on. So I think we need really to move forward and to see, I mean, this is more or less what countries in my region did during the pandemics, especially in 2020, as I said, with a lot of expenditure. Actually, 50% of the amount spent. I mean, in 2020, we had around $90 billion, covering almost 49% of the population in need. But in 2020, it went down to 50%. And in 2022, we don't have any more support for the families, or very little. So, and we need to invest on the health crisis, because the health crisis is still with us. We need to increase public expenditure. And I think we need to use this important moment as an opportunity. And here I just want to show vaccination in our region was used as a public good. And look at what happened. The pandemics, once the vaccination moved into levels of 70% of the population vaccinated, we really were able to control the pandemics. But the vaccines were for free. Of course, the state had to invest a lot of money on this. But once the vaccines were for free, and it was like an example of how health can be seen as a public good, and access to health must be for everyone. So, and these were the effects of the emergency transfers. But now that we are losing momentum, the poverty rates will increase. Definitely, we will have an increase in poverty in our region. And this is more or less what these measures were applied for. We, in ECLAC, a very detailed analysis was made on how this was done and how it helped to combat for particularly extreme poverty. The problem is how to sustain this and how to invest on tools, for example, the unemployment insurance. Unemployment insurance is only happening in 6 countries of our region. We need to expand it. It's so important to have unemployment insurance. So I think that we really need to spend more on labor policies. This is something that some countries are moving from cash transfers from a social perspective to labor policies, which means that they are making some agreements with the private sector and to protect income on the unemployed. So these labor policies can really be helpful. So let me stop here, dear David, and tell you that at the end of the day, what we are looking for is a welfare state, the care society that we believe is so very important. And I think I have, I hope, addressed some of the public policies challenges we have in the region: productivity, universal social welfare, investment, and of course, I think sustainability, which is at the end of the day where we want to go. Over to you, David.
Alicia, thanks so much. That was another tour de force with a really sort of practical hands-on focus as to a whole series of policies and dimensions of policies that can and need to be addressed, covering taxation and with the emphasis on production of public goods, which has become one of the themes of this conference, I think, one way or another. Thanks so much indeed on behalf of everybody here. Please, I'll encourage everybody to carry on contributing to the chat on that. about that. Well, I think this day has been pretty brilliant as a final day. It's hard to think of much that could add to it, but probably the one person who definitely can is Mariana Mazzucato. Mariana needs no introduction. She's become one of the best known economists in the world. And in the context of this conference, she's probably shifted narratives more powerfully than anybody else in the rest of the world. She has transformed the way everybody looks at their iPhone from a miracle of private enterprise to a tribute to public sector innovation policies. She's been from the start very supportive of this conference, and her agreeing to speak in this final session is a further mark of support. So Mariana, thank you very much for all the support. And over to you now. We're very pleased to be hearing you finish up this conference. Thanks very much indeed.
Great. Well, don't thank me. I should thank you for putting this together, and especially as a collaboration with the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, which I founded in 2017. So we'll be celebrating our 5th anniversary this year. And thanks especially to Jenny on our team for collaborating with you all. So now I'm going to do the difficult thing with sharing screens without sharing all your emails at the same time. So am I sharing? And I will put it on full screen. Amazing. So let me just put full screen. Usually takes a second. There we go. So I think you said I have about 30 minutes. Is that right? Hopefully everyone's not too tired. I wasn't sure whether to do it with slides or not, but just listening to Alicia, who is, as usual, very inspirational. And I'm so, happy that we're also collaborating now on this new water commission. I wanted to pick up actually through this deck some of the points she talked about, because they are very much actually at the center of this new book that I wrote that came out last year, which is almost a recipe book, because my previous 2 books, at least the popular books, not the boring academic ones that cost so much money no one actually buys them, but the ones I actually wrote to shift the narratives were a bit more theoretical. One was kind of more on the history of technology, but the value book was unpicking the kind of new theories of value and the evolution of actually value theory in order to rethink the state and policy. But this missions book for me was kind of out of urgency of saying, all right, now how are we actually going to do this stuff differently? What does it mean for how we design industrial strategy differently, design procurement strategy differently, design public banks differently? Because for all the reasons that Alicia talked about, the status quo is failing us miserably. So I'd like to maybe just focus on some of the highlights that I thought about in writing this book, but it also very much goes to the core of why I set up the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, because I think there's no lack of great ideas out there by everyone on this Zoom, I'm sure, but also others who've been talking about public policy for a while. What IPPs try to do is to say, well, what does that then mean for the training, literally, for the curriculum that we need for the civil service globally in order to actually implement some of these ideas? And I'm sure Alicia agrees with that, because in Latin America, but definitely also on the African continent, but also on the European continent, if I think of Italy, for example, where I'm from, there's, again, great ideas, but the implementation capacity is really suffering. And it's hard to get stronger implementation capacity if we don't have a new way, literally, of thinking and training and investing within our public administrations, which have really suffered from decades of outsourcing and privatization. Rosie Collington and I, a PhD student at IIPP, are actually writing a book about the history of consulting and outsourcing, which we also hope to really help kind of change that narrative, which underpins the very problematic practice we have on the ground. So let's see, why are these not moving? And this is sort of the big picture change of narrative that IIPP has been trying to do, which is very much the language, but this language that's problematic, like just fixing markets versus actively shaping them, is then used actually to design the tools we have. So the reason the tools we have are so limited, forget the ideological reasons, there's also that, of course, but even when we're trying to do our best, we end up with pretty lame and boring tools because it's all just about fixing problems here and there. So you are, by design, too little, too late, by design on the periphery, if you're just fixing markets. So that's really something that we're trying to do, create this new framing of not just fixing markets, even though we should also fix them, but actively co-creating and co-shaping them, very much from a Polanyi-esque kind of view and starting point, Karl Polanyi, where markets are understood as outcomes of those decision processes we make in all sorts of institutions, especially the public sector institutions. The narratives about one side just de-risking the other side is complete bullshit too. That by definition makes it more interesting to work on the side that's taking risks instead of just de-risking. The whole, problems around picking winners. We know that that's also an ideological pushback on picking winners, but it's also true that there's been many problems with picking particular technologies, particular sectors. So part of what I'll be talking about is what does it look like when you're actually picking a direction, being really bold on that direction and tilting towards that direction, and then picking the willing that are willing to move with you as a government and as a policymaker. What does it look like literally for the design of the policy? Again, a public bank that's just bailing out sectors that are saying, help, help, that's picking winners, or picking specific types of firms or sectors. Picking the willing is, all right, you want help? Well, here's some conditions attached of the kind that that Alicia was talking about in order to receive that public loan. You have to show that you're willing to move with us in a direction, lowering the material content of steel if steel wants money. Again, the whole outsourcing, actually building the dynamic capabilities within the public sector. This is very much at the center of the narrative, the framing, the re-theorizing, the new practice in IPP. What does it look like to talk about the dynamic capabilities within our public institutions? What's the theory for that? What's the training? What's the culture of risk-taking? And also the whole evaluation side of things. We've been working very closely. I'll kind of repeat some of this stuff a bit slower in a minute, but we've been working closely with governments around the evaluation side as well. It's not just how do we value the role of the public sector, which we know we should value much better. How do we construct it so it's more ambitious, strategic, mission-oriented, but also once it does its thing, whether it's in health, energy, or digital, how do we evaluate success? And you're again set up to fail if it's all just about cost-benefit analysis, net present value calculations, and which market failure did you fix? So what are the more dynamic metrics that we can actually use so that we get this more virtuous and not a vicious cycle in terms of also how we evaluate? So this is really kind of the big picture shift in narrative that the Institute is trying to put forth, both on the research side, on the training side for the curriculum, but also very much at the policy level. One thing that I'm very proud about in the Institute is we don't just do policy as an afterthought, at the end of our papers, oh, here's our policy conclusions, listen to us, we're so smart. That's the kind of a typical academic, including many of my papers, I've done that style. We actually think about the policy and the practice from the beginning, and we call this practice-based theorizing. So what are the kind of new practices, the bold new policies that we think we're all advocating for? What's the theory that needs to underpin that? But actually, when we, in a humble way, go out there and try to implement some of this, it's messy as hell. We need to bring back that learning to the theory itself. So that feedback between practice and theory is very much at the heart of what we do. And we've just set up a new policy lab called the IPP Policy Studio to actually try to prototype that process, because it's easy to say practice-based theorizing, it's harder to do. And the reason, again, I kind of wrote this latest book, Mission Economy, was just that, all the different crises that we are facing, and they're all interlapping. It's not like we go from one to another and the previous one disappears. We have financial crisis, the health crisis, the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, the water crisis, and we are about to enter a new financial crisis. I'm sure you all know that, but just look at the ratio in countries like the UK of private debt to disposable income, very high levels, almost at record levels, that caused the financial crisis. You'd think we'd all be talking about that. It's nowhere to be seen in conversations in the FT or anywhere. So this particular moment, though, the COVID moment, it just totally revealed, it's not like we needed to know this even more, but if anyone was in doubt, it totally revealed how unprepared we are for each one of these crises. With this one, we were unprepared with personal protection equipment, not delivered, still not delivered in many parts of the world to frontline workers, totally unprepared with test and trace. Both of these, by the way, are not exactly rocket science. we just forgot to invest in the capacity to do that. So the UK ended up outsourcing to Deloitte, test and trace. And the last time I checked, Deloitte was not exactly an expert in that. In fact, they failed miserably with very little accountability. Very unprepared on the vaccine issue. I currently have the honor of chairing the World Health Organization Council on the Economics of Health for All, an all-woman council, by the way. And when they ask us why, we say, why the bleep, bleep, not. But anyway, this all-woman Health for All Council says, if health for all is the mission, how do you backtrack and design the economy to deliver on that? And with the vaccine's not the mission. Vaccinating everybody in the world is the mission. And we failed miserably to deliver on that because, again, the economic tools, including tools like intellectual property rights, have hardly been designed to do that. And that's why there's been really kind of rigorous demands for having a patent pool, and not just around the vaccines, but sharing of knowledge around the therapeutics, the drugs, whether it's remdesivir or anything, during a health pandemic. Even just from purely selfish grounds, we should be doing that, because as long as one part of the world is unvaccinated, the virus comes back to bite us. But we are so selfish and stupid that we didn't do that.
Cities after COVID, what is it? What could be the solutions?
Is that a question? What was that? Okay, I'll keep going. I don't know if someone was unmuted there. But anyway, so, actually designing intellectual property rights, designing public sector procurement, designing the kind of capacity we need on the ground in order to deliver on something like a vaccination of the entire world is hardly what we did. And we have today vaccine apartheid. That's what Dr. Tedros, the head of the WHO, calls it. We also, of course, were totally unprepared, continue to be unprepared with the climate crisis. Greta Thunberg reminds us that we keep blah, blah, blahing around this. But just look at the numbers, even during COVID-19 recovery periods, we continued to use those kinds of monies that came out of thin air, because we can create money. We know that. We just tend to do it only during emergencies and during wars and forget to do it in normal times. But it's incredible just how much of that money actually went to very problematic parts of the economy. Very little conditionalities I'll come back to but later that Alicia talked about, but also in 2019 and in Europe, the region where I live, we just massively continued to subsidize the fossil fuel industry. And that's years after the IPCC report's been telling us, stop, you don't have so much time. So again, all these interlinking crises, and on top of this one, definitely think of the big water one that Alicia and I are working on. So one of the things I've been trying to say is, first of all, let's just stop patching our way on each one. Think about a truly proactive way of thinking about the problems that we have, but before they arrive, right? All of these problems, if you think of water, of biodiversity, of climate and health, could actually be used to really structure, design, imagine, bring together different stakeholders on the future, focus on the opportunities that we have, on all these big global challenges that can actually be formulated as inspirationally as we formulated the kind of moon landing 50 years ago, but also think of all the investments, the innovation in the private sector, investments in the public sector. All of these could also become opportunities for working together in a very different way, making profits, but not excess profits. I'll come back to excess profits. But that would require a very different structure on the ground, a very different governance of government, a different governance of business, a different governance of finance. So I just have 3 slides here to depress you a bit even more. And this is why the structure of the actors on the ground needs to change. I'm going to focus most of my next, 15 minutes on the solutions, but just to maybe repeat something you all know, we have a financial sector which basically continues to finance itself. In the UK, something like 80% of finance goes back to finance, insurance, and real estate. Very handy acronym there, FIRE. This is a graph from Andy Halding, a bit updated, but just showing just how much financial intermediation has outpaced the growth of the rest of the economy. And it's not a surprise, right? Even during COVID, we just filled the system with loans, help to buy schemes, thinking that's going to make things great when people are already, again, indebted up to their ears. So just throwing into the system a lot of credit while real wages haven't been growing, something that the current strikes in the UK are reminding us, the trade union leaders, doesn't help the system and just feeds an ultra-financialized financial sector. And if that was the only problem, then we'd be fine. We could just reform finance. Unfortunately, we have a business sector that is ultra-financialized. And you see this through the data that's collected by people like Bill Lazonic. I've done some work on this. Antonio Andreoni from our institute has as well, and so on. But looking, for example, just how much, like this lack of reinvestment of profits back into the system is a huge issue. And this should be, by the way, at the, sorry, this is just showing that combination of share buybacks and dividend payouts with people like Bill have been focusing on, which just shows, this huge focus on just maximizing shareholder value instead of what people talk about as stakeholder value, but that's a bit of a blah, blah, blah too. So over $4 trillion in the last decade has been spent by the Fortune 500 companies just on buying back their own stock to boost share prices, stock options, and executive pay. And this lack of reinvestment, again, should be in the front pages of many papers. You see it in terms of the I of GDP. Yes, we need better measures than just GDP, but even with classic GDP, with no happiness indicators, we see just how much both the previous point I made of consumption-led growth fueled by private debt, but also how business investment in many countries has been falling, and it's not a surprise. It's due to this lack of reinvestment of profits into production. And even the digital agenda, it's not the robots that are taking jobs. Robots have been taking jobs since the 1800s. David Ricardo wrote about that in chapter 31 of Principles of Political Economy. He talked about, in the chapter called On Machinery, mechanization was labor displacing. But as long as the profits generated were reinvested back in, new jobs, new skills, new sectors appeared. So that corporate governance issue is huge. And this is why you have a lot of the business community at least blah-blahing a bit about this whole shareholder value maximization problem, but we're not seeing change. In fact, in many companies, including Apple, it's just gone completely out of the roof. In fact, under Steve Jobs, there was no share buybacks. Under Tim Cook, this is his big business strategy. So I could say much more about this. I'll just move on. Otherwise, this is a whole discussion in itself. But this third governance issue, finance, business, and then government governance is the one I focus on the most, and why the Institute was founded, in terms of how do we get away from, at worst, the stuff that, to be honest, most adults don't talk about anymore, which is government, just get out of the way, the Reagan, Thatcherite. That's not really the problem. The problem is, at best, we talk about, correcting for all these different problems, whether it's asymmetric information, negative externalities with the carbon tax. And of course we need carbon taxes, but if they're seeing as just patching things up, that's the problem. Investing in things like basic R&D because of the positive externalities, clean water, all these kind of things. If they're seen as just bandaging up a system, which otherwise works perfectly, but now and then screws up and needs the government bandages, you will always be in bandaging up mode, and by design, be too little, too late. So in the kind of 3 books that I've written recently, at least, I tried to unpick all these problems. And as I mentioned, in that first one, it was what it was mentioned before, the kind of iPhone theater, which is not so much that the state invented the iPhone. Of course, that's not true. But everything that makes it smart and not stupid was state funded. Internet, GPS, touchscreen, Siri. So first of all, just recognizing that. Second of all, what was the dynamic inside those organizations that made those investments, the kind of DARPA model? What does it look like to be a purpose-oriented organization? The internet didn't come about because anyone obsessed about the internet, like we obsess today about AI and so on. They had a problem. The problem was getting the satellites to communicate. GPS solved a problem. It wasn't that people said, oh, we need GPS so we can have Ubers. The problem was knowing where the hell the ships were in the ocean by the Navy. So how can we do that also outside the military-industrial complex? What would it mean to have true purpose-oriented organizations around a green transition strategy, around health? So a mission/purpose-oriented public investment. So seeing it both as an investment, not just an expenditure, but also that organizational culture. In the value book, I kind of said, what does this mean in terms of how we actually rethink value, how we rethink wealth creation? I think one of the problems, Alicia, that we have in places like Latin America is that actually progressive like ourselves haven't talked enough about wealth creation, value creation. And as important as redistribution is, there's nothing to redistribute unless we also talk about value. But if we don't take our hands on the concepts of value, the new theories of value, the new ways to elevate the concept of value creation up from a progressive agenda, then unfortunately we get stuck in these redistributive. And the real redistribution that should be happening is at that pre-distributive level of getting those conditions right in the first place, so you don't have to pick up the mess after. And I'll really just spend the last 10 minutes here on this mission economy book on some of the design challenges. And it might be a good one to finish the conference on, in terms of just kind of really moving forwards on the nitty gritty, the recipe book. And it's a good Italian mama who cooks a lot. I'll do the recipe book version. So of course we know that the challenges we have are not as easy as going to the moon. We all know that. We don't have to repeat that. However, I think what is really unappreciated is how 50 years ago, one of the most difficult feats ever that humanity did, which was not just going to the moon, but getting back and doing it in a short amount of time, required a complete organizational change, a complete change in the tools that were used, and a complete change in how public and private work together. And this notion of new partnerships that we need for the SDGs, I think, both CEPAL, where Alicia led and did such an amazing job. We should also clap Alicia, because she's recently stepped down, but she's been such an important visionary leader in Latin America and globally through her work in CEPAL and ECLAC. But this idea of more symbiotic, mutualistic partnerships to tackle the problems that I've already mentioned: biodiversity, water, climate, strengthening our health systems. We would never be able to do them, or sorry, I should say the opposite. We would have never gone to the moon had we then talked about things in such a boring way as we talk about them today, in terms of just kind of using words like partnership and then, doing a rosary and hoping for the best. How do you design a partnership that is truly kind of like a moonshot, and is symbiotic and is paying attention to those tools? And so they were, really explicit about the directionality, really explicit about the difficulty. All the policy wonk speeches, or not speeches, well, speeches too, but papers today are all about facilitating, de-risking. First thing Kennedy said is, we're doing this because it's hard, not because it's easy. And, facilitating, one side facilitating the other means making it easier. That doesn't get you anywhere. Why should the state make things easier for business? What you're trying to do is actually embrace difficulty together, embrace uncertainty together, embrace experimentation together. That requires a very specific type of partnership and organizational structure, which you don't get when one side thinks it's just de-risking the other. Real attention they pay to organizational design. I'll come to this in a second. Their tools were changed from day one to be outcomes focused, because they realized that the way they were doing procurement didn't work, would never have gotten us to the moon. And the partnerships, they had things like no excess profits clauses. I mean, how cool is that? So, definitely embraced a lot of uncertainty, had no clue how to get there from the start, finally ended up on this lunar orbit rendezvous, but along the way screwed up massively. That's normal, trial and error and error and error. We know that's true for venture capitalists. Why don't we allow that within our civil service? As soon as you have big public mistakes, bang, front page of the paper. But what NASA did was they learned from their failures. In the Apollo 1 fire, for example, one of the things they learned, and Gus Grissom, who died in that fire, said, how the hell are we going to get to the moon if we can't even talk between 2 or 3 buildings? Those vertical silos, which we all know exist in every government, where you have the health department, the energy department, the treasury not really working with an all-of-government approach, they realized that this was a problem in NASA. And they brought in this guy, George Mueller, to change how NASA was structured, with project managers, with their delegated teams in constant conversation, one with the other. So instead of just saying, oh God, yeah, we all work in our silos because bureaucracies are so inertial and slow, they changed their bureaucracy. This is, again, something that IIPP focuses on a lot. What does an outcomes-oriented organization look like in terms of culture, in terms of embracing uncertainty, but also in terms of communication flows between the different departments? They achieved huge amounts of spillovers along the way across so many different sectors. It wasn't just aerospace, it was electronics, materials, nutrition, aerospace, software. And what we've been advocating for is that this must be the way that we tackle all our problems. It can't be that renewable or climate is about just renewable energy, or health is just about pharmaceuticals. We need an intersectoral approach, just like NASA had to go to the moon. But how do you bring all these different sectors together? It doesn't just happen by saying, oh, let's partner, let's go do fun stuff together. It has to actually be designed into the way that government interacts. And that's where the kind of picking the willing stuff comes in. And this is one of the things they did. They really changed how they were doing procurement from cost plus procurement that was creating a bit of a parasitic relationship with the private sector towards fixed price, like a challenge-led type of procurement, but with constant embedded incentives for quality improvement and innovation. And they had this no excess profits. What does excess mean? An excess of what you actually did. So think of the 220 model of venture capital. You get 2% no matter what happens, 20% if things go well. If you actually look at where that VC enters into most sectors, it's way after the government actually took on most of the early stage, high risk, capital intensive investments. So no excess profits there is not to say no profits, but what is the right amount of profits that, for example, a venture capitalist should be having in a sector like biotech, nanotech, clean tech, health tech, which is so collaborative, so collective. And this is something that NASA was aware of, that they were making huge amounts of investments up front. They were collaborating with lots of different actors, and no excess profits was embedded in the contract in this pre-distributive way to make sure it didn't turn into a gambling casino, which I would argue space today is. And that would be a whole rant against Elon Musk, which I won't go into. The same guy who changed procurement, this guy Ernest Brackett, was very aware that NASA already back then was outsourcing a lot of its knowledge. That was already becoming a trend. It later escalated a lot. And he said something so important. He said, if we continue to do this, we won't even know who to work with. We won't know how to write the terms of reference. We won't know which private actors, which sectors, what the new technological opportunities are out there, what in the management world is called absorptive capacity. And this is what's happened. I would argue, most of the governments I'm familiar with have undergone this massive retrenching. It's not just about public sector budgets. It's very much about the remit and the outsourcing. And we shouldn't confuse budgets with outsourcing, because the truth is the budgets actually often go up, both because they have to take care of the mess that gets created when you outsource everything to the Sercos and G4Ss for the UK audience. You know what I'm talking about, but also by reducing your own a budget and your own capacity, you end up again having to spend money later to pick up the problems. So this guy said, we need more capabilities inside NASA and investing in our brain, otherwise we'll get captured, he said, by brochuremanship. So you didn't have sexy McKinsey PowerPoints at the time. They had nice brochures. And this is what's happened. Many governments have been captured by brochuremanship. And it's not just the consulting company's fault. It's very much this kind of fear of taking risks even within the government, preferring to move that risk over to someone else, not making those investments within. Yes, there's austerity. Yes, many countries have had to do that, but it's also sometimes been a choice, and we shouldn't forget that. Of course, in many developing countries, it's actually been embedded in the conditions attached to IMF and World Bank loans. But anyway, this is a very broad problem, which was just so interesting that NASA thought about it, right? And yes, there was all those spillovers along the way, but what we really should be looking at, which is the amount then was about the equivalent today of $300 billion dollars worth of funding for the whole Apollo program. But the real kind of multiplier effect that happened that you can see through all those spillovers was because how the system itself was designed. And that's where we really need to be careful. Anything like a Keynesian multiplier, which we've all been teaching, calculating, and so on, doesn't just happen because you put in money, helicopter money into the system. It has to be designed so it truly has that catalytic effect. Catalytic effect, having additionality in the system, which sometimes can be built in through conditionality, in the ways that I and others have been writing about, but also through inspiration. If you're creating a funky new sector and really inspirational around moonshot kind of programs, you do also tend to excite others more, as opposed to just thinking that you're facilitating and worried to be business friendly and setting up direct incentives, which end up just increasing profits and not investment. So I'm almost done. Basically, the rest of the slides, which I don't have time to go through, I see here I have 3 minutes left, are about, well, what does this then mean for tackling these wicked challenges that aren't just about technological change? They require, of course, behavioral change, all sorts of regulatory change, and so on. And what I did about 4 years ago is I tried to convince the European Commission successfully, which was nice. Often we, tell people what to do and they don't do it. But the European Commission listened to this idea that we should be going beyond the blah, blah challenges or the blah, blah SDGs. And the SDGs aren't blah, blah. We've just blah, blahing about them, and turn them into missions, carbon neutral cities, getting the digital divide to be zero in specific places, whether at the city level or regional level or national level, getting the plastic out of the ocean, SDG 14. So turning them into missions that get as many different sectors together and really foster that bottom-up experimentation, but that's not going to happen without a new social contract, for example, with business, really embedding those conditionalities into grants, loans, public bank design, bailout programs, recovery funds. And this is basically the model. I think some of you who've heard me rant about this will have seen this. The clean oceans ones, plastic-free ocean, carbon-neutral cities, all those different sectors that need to be brought together. And this approach, by the way, I think is even more important in the developing world, where we have, for example, the natural resource kind of curse, where countries have been obsessing about particular sectors, seeing them in terms of a sector like copper in Chile. Well, what if you start looking at copper as one of those sectors in terms of that intersectoral collaboration that's actually fueling new types of collaborations for a sustainable growth mission? That would be a very different relationship, even with the subsidies that sector gets, in terms of it being an input towards something bigger than itself, right? So moon landing, not just about aerospace, nutrition, electronics, materials, same kind of logic there. And in working on this, like one of the things I emphasize is that this is all also about different governance structures. What does it mean for crowding in other forms of finance? What does it mean for portfolio setting? What does it mean for evaluation that I already mentioned, going beyond cost-benefit analysis? How do we actually measure those dynamic intersectoral spillovers? And a lot of this requires boldness and confidence in the room of when you're actually negotiating the deals. So if you're not seeing yourself as just enabling and facilitating, but actually co-creating, making these investments, setting clear directions, picking the willing, the energy in the room is very different than if it's like, oh, what do you need us to help you with in order to get a sustainable growth pathway? We did a report in the Institute with UNDP looking actually during COVID just how some countries did so much better than others, even in the developing context where they were facing obviously great challenges, but because they had made investments, and I'm thinking of places like Kerala in India, Vietnam, Rwanda, Togo, had actually made investments within their own public administrations due to previous viruses that they had to learn from, but also choices they actually made even around the infodemic side of things, getting people into government that understand something about digital platforms. The city of Barcelona, by the way, has done this recently by hiring hackers into the civil service. These things really, really matter. And I encourage you to see this publication. I'm just going to skip ahead. This is just a quick one about why it's important to think about this with industrial strategy. These are 4 challenge areas that we worked with the UK government to think about instead of their old 5 sectors. And that meant that something like future of mobility, which was a challenge, would have to bring in lots of different sectors from robotics, the creative sector, digital, and so on. And having a really clear mission that included accessibility, congestion-free, admission-free, zero accident systems meant that some of those bottom-up projects would include the world, say, of disabilities, right? So this is a kind of setup. And this isn't just a policy design thing. This really is a way to put public purpose at the center, but also then using words like the common good, not just as a public good to correct for something the private sector is not doing, but common good in terms of how we work together, how we collaborate together. And that issue of conditionality, I keep coming back to because it's central. It's not just about giving some tax incentives or subsidies or loans here and there. So let me just maybe finish by saying one thing I haven't said, which is the work we've been doing at the city level. And today I gave a talk at the World Urban Forum virtually because it's in Poland and I'm in London today, but we have a council on urban initiatives that brings a lot of different mayors together. This work at the city level I've been learning a lot from. So Camden is the part of London where I work, and the leader of Camden Council, Georgia Gould, asked me to co-chair a Camden Renewal Commission. So very local, even more local than a city. And one of the things I've been learning a lot from it, based on Camden's own kind of philosophy, vision, and experience, is how to bring citizens and people into the mix early on, right? So that it's not this condescending thing of a bunch of elites, as Alicia was saying, going around telling everyone what's good for them, but really bringing, for example, people from the resident associations and the social housing estates and the citizen assemblies to the table, actually to debate, what does it mean to have a green mission? What does it mean to live together in a more sustainable way? What does it mean to turn a food bank, which depressingly have increased during COVID, into a food cooperative? So the people making the decisions are the same who are benefiting from those types of agencies, right? So that co-creation done in a non-tokenistic way, the participatory side, is incredibly enriching to people's souls. And I think that's incredibly important, especially in a world of such polarization and distrust. See it, in the anti-vax movement and so on. There's a real distrust of business and government because also of how we've operated ourselves in the kind of Davos jet set community. So learning more about the social innovation that can really put participation at the center, I think, is very important. This issue of conditionalities, France has been much more bold than most other European countries on it in terms of the kind of new social contract. The subsidies that were given to Renault and Air France during COVID were conditional on them committing to lower their material content. There's been other forms of that. And I think this also is just something we have to come back to, how to design a new social contract. And ideally, it's really win-win and not just a stick, but it's not going to happen just by talking about ecosystems. This is really important in the health innovation space, as I already mentioned in the beginning. Intellectual property rights are contracts. You get a 20-year monopoly with a patent. So you don't need to reduce the tax on the profits generated from that, which is a patent box policy, which many countries are doing. What we actually need is how to govern patents so they're not so extractive. They shouldn't be so wide. They shouldn't be so strong, hard to license, and surely they shouldn't be so upstream. And this is my last slide, I promise. A lot of this came together for me also in terms of thinking of the new economic thinking that's required behind everything I've just talked about. And these, this is just sort of a summary slide of how I bring it together at the end of the book around rethinking value as collectively created, so it should also be collectively distributed. That's the kind of pre-distributive lens. Markets in that Polanyi kind of way of needing to be shaped and co-created, not fixed. Those dynamic capabilities and capacity we need inside our public sector. So it's not just about fighting against austerity, it's about arguing for much more ambition and creativity within our administrations themselves. Outcomes-based tools, whether it's public banks or procurement, this pre-distributive, specific ways to share both risks and rewards. Partnership, I think we need metrics for that. Like, what does a symbiotic versus a parasitic partnership look like? That's crucial. And we know we have lots of parasitic partnerships, but how can we, along the way, make sure that we're steering these partnerships to be very different from the ones that got us a very problematic health sector, for example, where there's lots of public money, lots of private money, but a very problematic way that they're working together. And this last point I just made about participatory systems. So thank you so much. Done.
Mariana, fantastic. I think we'll forgive you for overrunning by 8 minutes. That was terrific. Please show your hands in the usual way if you've got questions or comments to Mariana. I can see one hand, but I can't tell whose it is, I think. Jenny, can you tell whose hand is waving? No, what? Okay. Well,
sorry, I cannot see the hands from my view, but I can see that there's really interesting discussions in the chat. It keeps coming in. Oh, I see one. Yes, so from Al-Hassan Adam.
Al-Hassan. Okay. Al-Hassan.
Yeah, thanks, Mariana, for the presentation. Am I right to say that in terms of the projection of private sector collaboration with government is not the question of private sector's power taking over the project and running and delivering it? Is the question of government having control over the project? And then you have a targeted involvement where private sector has a particular skill or component that they are providing. So for instance, using your example of the moonshot, Motorola coming in probably for their communications capability, but not designing the project of the moon landing and leading it. So NASA did not kind of give out, hey, private sector, you have these skills and here's it, you go and land on the moon for us. But
That's
what
exactly
we're seeing, so what we're seeing now is government reducing their capabilities and increasing private sector capabilities and say that is partnership, but actually that's not. It's about dismantling the state. So I would like you to address that question, if not.
Well, you just summed up perfectly exactly the thesis of the book. So that's the argument I make, that what NASA actually did was have strong directionality. I mentioned that in the beginning, and it worked with lots of different private actors, but it wasn't outsourcing the direction. It knew what it was doing. It had clear goals, and it brought in the private sector, and it knew how to pick the best kind of partners. I'm not saying it was perfect, by the way. There was also, I'm sure, lots of issues of corruption and all sorts of that stuff, which, should be talked about in every context. But the point is that this guy, Ernest Brackett, was aware, even though they had a strong, direction and they were working with the private sector exactly in that more symbiotic way that you just talked about, there was already then the start of what later became the current problem, which was just outsourcing and allowing the direction itself to be set by the private sector, which is what I would argue even in the space sector we have today. I worked with NASA about 6 years ago, and I documented this in an article I wrote with Doug Robinson. 50% of NASA R&D is currently directed by a private sector agency called CASIS, C-A-S-I-S. I think they actually finally got rid of them, partly because of the articles we wrote, which were basically a lot of people who didn't get jobs in McKinsey. So even worse than that problem, who then were hired by NASA to help NASA decide which private companies to work with, especially around low Earth orbit. So it just reeked of insecurity. It reeked of a lack of a direction. It actually ended up causing nepotistic issues because this particular agency ended up bringing in kind of random private actors to work with NASA. But the point is that NASA itself should, of course, be working with the private sector, but in exactly the way that you just talked about, with a strong direction and knowledge and systems in place for kind of picking the willing and also designing those partnerships. So it's that contrast you make. And so it's not about whether you're working or not with the private sector. It is around, who's setting the direction, and do we have conditionalities in place that make sure that the kind of, summation of the parts is moving us in a direction, as opposed to also potentially just creating a very chaotic system. Space today is full of garbage, literally debris. So the astronauts can't see anything. We have an unregulated space sector because of all these playboys who, on the back of huge public subsidies, are, doing space tourism. That's not a very well-directed system.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hassan. I think there's a questions from Dave and Emanuele Lobina as well.
And I think Jenny, you said that Alicia and Anis, that we should let people also I hear echo here. Not sure why I'm echoing, but people should feel free to ask questions, not just to me.
Sorry, Dave, you were saying?
Are you letting me ask my question?
Yeah, so actually, because you raised hands, so okay. I was just wondering when you want to say something.
Yeah, that's right. I think you partly started answering the question I was going to ask in your last slide, Mariana. But one thing, there are two things that struck me as you talked through. One is when you were talking earlier on about how to evaluate outcomes and how to evaluate missions and public goods, you talked about involving governments. But towards the end, you talked more about participation as being important in formulating missions and implicitly evaluating them. And I wonder, could you say more about that and whether actually involving communities at whatever levels is actually a very important and powerful way of creating the missions in the first place, of creating the, agreeing what the public goods are. And the second part of that question is that really you've constructed all this in terms of the language of missions, by analogy with the moonshot. But traditionally it would have been called planning, I think more so, and that when you display all those graphs and charts and all the rest of it, I mean, clearly what is happening is incredibly rich in a very positive sense, not a negative sense. Detailed planning of how to mobilize resources in order to achieve specific ends, and you keep coming back to that. So is this the rebirth of planning, and does participation mean it can be the birth of, as it were, a genuinely popular democratic form of planning?
Yeah, I mean, really good points and questions underlying them. So on the first one, definitely this, so there's two different things in terms of how at least I raised it here. One is setting the missions themselves, I think needs, in some cases, it depends what the missions are, much more participation, also just to give them legitimacy and resilience so that it's not just some minister's pet project, but truly comes out of kind of a stakeholder engagement. And we should remember that even the SDGs, which aren't missions, are the challenges that we should be using to set missions, did come out of actually massive stakeholder engagement, not so much necessarily at the community level, but lots of different countries, you know, negotiated what ended up coming out. So they're not perfect in any way, but we shouldn't think of them as having just been, you know, flown down from someone at the UN and then, you know, in all our kind of policy books. So what was that stakeholder engagement that came up even with those challenges? What would have been a better way to do it potentially, but definitely at the mission level, not at the challenge level, to make them actually mean something and catalyze that kind of both intersectoral, interdepartment, but especially the inspiration bit. Just think of all the people looking up at the sky, or, you know, during the moon landing, or all the kids who all of a sudden wanted to study STEM subjects, or the janitor, famous, you know, I don't even know if it's true or not, but the story goes that a janitor in NASA was asked, you know, and what are you doing? He's like, I'm putting a man on the moon too. So like people really felt skin in the game on it. It was, so how do you do that? It's really hard when these are like technocratic missions. You don't end up catalyzing that. So partly even just for the success of the missions, regardless of the fact that we want people to have more participation, because we think it's also good for humanity to be involved and so on, they're also more successful. And you know, it's interesting that the oceans mission, the plastic-free one, I think has gotten off much more precisely because of even films, you know, documentaries like David Attenborough's Blue Planet, where a lot of kids who saw that last episode of all these dolphins and so on choking on plastic and dying just kind of galvanized the imagination. So how do you do that both with the arts, sorry, someone's at my door, I'll ignore it, but also just through different types of, you know, work with communities to get people to talk about the missions and to truly co-design them. And that's what I meant at the city level. It's just easier. You know, it's just because it's a local context. But it's not easy without investing in those fora, like citizen assemblies or different types of fora that would be brought to the table. So if you don't have resident associations, you can't just say, oh, everyone come and talk, right? Because then you'll tokenistically be bringing people to the table. So labor unions, right? We have them. Why aren't they at the table? So we talk about the just transition, but that's putting labor unions at the ex post level of defending workers' rights along the way, making sure that they're invested in, but they're not at the table. In terms of, you know, think of Albert, or was it Alfred, or sorry, Albert Hirschman's, oh God, was it Alfred or Albert? Alicia. Can't remember. Anyway, Hirschman's talk about voice, right? Whose voice is at the table? Getting labor's voice at the table ex ante is something that I think should be very important in terms of co-creation. So it's not just about like people, it's about organizations that represent different voices. Yeah, definitely with the planning. And, you know, I was at I just mentioned it today at the World Urban Forum. I mentioned that the last urban forum that I attended live was in Abu Dhabi the month before COVID became a household word. So it was like February 2020. And the president of Afghanistan was there. And we all know what then happened later in Afghanistan. So all this is actually incredibly crazy to think about. he said in his speech, he gave the keynote speech at the opening of that conference, he said, we need to move away from long-term planning and old ways of thinking about planning towards design thinking. And while I thought it was really interesting, I was like, well, what does he mean exactly? Because actually what you want is design thinking and the ability to deal with complexity, uncertainty, and so on in how we do planning. So it's not about either planning or kind of complexity science and design thinking and all the sexy stuff that the MIT Innovation Lab used to talk about before they got in trouble, but how you actually, do the planning that you just said is required for any long-run growth strategy, but investing, and this is my main point, within the public administration's ability to deal with uncertainty, to be willing to experiment, to learn by doing. And, there's two problems there. Don't worry about screwing up because you have to mess up in order to learn. But if you're not investing in your own learning capacity, then you're not going to learn from that failure and you will repeat the same failure. The problem is not failing, it's repeating the same mistakes over and over because you didn't invest. And that's one of the greatest, I think, outcomes of austerity. We ended up with kind of stupid public institutions. Lord Agnew, who's a Tory conservative lord in the UK, has said this recently, that Whitehall has become infantilized, he said, because of this over outsourcing, over reliance on whether it's consulting companies or the private sector. And this is a Tory lord saying it, let alone,
That's wonderful. Thank you, Mariana. And I think I would like to bring to the spotlight three, I don't know whether Satoko is still here, but we have we still have Anis here, Alicia and Mariana here. We are aware that we're about 6 minutes past the time for the for the closing remarks. Probably we can actually address one last question from Emanuele Lobina, Associate Professor from University of Greenwich. Emanuele, do you want to raise your questions?
Yes, thanks, Mariana. First of all, thanks. That was truly inspirational. My question goes back to the question asked by Alassane before about symbiotic and parasitic partnerships. Now, having studied the water sector for years, the first word that comes to my mind when I think about parasitic partnerships is PPPs.
Yeah.
And so, there are two ways to address the issue. One is to look at the techniques of how you can structure a symbiotic partnership. And I think that you have addressed that in your answer to Alassane. There is another way to look at that, which is about the systemic culture. And my question to you, having had, first-hand experience of dealing with this important policy players, is how do we change the culture? And the dominant culture of the day is that of new public management, whereas parasitic partnerships seem to be okay, accepted as normal. So the question is, how do we change the systemic culture of new public management? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Do we still have the echo? No, good. I unfortunately have to leave in like 3 minutes because I'm meant to address the World Health Organization's directors. So I'm going to be sort of quick. So the irony I find, because I agree with everything you said, but you mentioned new public management and public choice theory. So again, the whole point of us in IIPP trying to redesign the curriculum for the civil service is actually you can't get better policy without a new type of training that's not the one that's coming from new public management and public choice theory, which very much then determines the culture. But the irony is that the way that public choice theory became what it is they basically convinced governments that government failure is even worse than market failure, right? Because of the risk of corruption and capture and so on. So this fear of getting corrupted then makes you like kind of scared to the point that in Italy, are you from Italy? I'm just looking from the name. Yeah, okay. In Italy, as you know, procurement is actually done and designed in, what's it called? ANAC, l'Associazione Nazionale dell'Anticorruzione. So an agency dedicated to anti-corruption determines how procurement is done in Italy. So instead of, And even the word procurement in Italy, appalto, is just a contract, right? So it's just a contract between two parties. Whereas the word procurement means you want something. There's desire. I don't want to sexualize procurement, but still, there's desire in terms of what you need, what you want. If you want school meals in Sweden to be healthy, tasty, and sustainable, which is what Sweden does, that will determine how the government then interacts with the private sector by having actually these really clear objectives. But if you're told don't have any objectives because the market's going to set the objective, and all you need to do is the horizontal conditions, set the rules of the game, fix some market failures and get out of the way, don't have a mission, don't have a plan, don't have directionality, just level the playing field, don't tilt the playing field, then you're opening yourself up to corruption. So the irony is you will get more corrupted, you will have more opportunities for nepotism in the system that actually doesn't allow, at least ex ante, government to have this kind of remit around public purpose, missions, and kind of direction setting. Why? Because then your relationship with the private sector is literally just a contract. And because you have to fear corruption and capture, it's done in an agency that's all about fear, as opposed to the goals. You know, the SDGs kind of driving the agency's remit and structure in the same way that DARPA came up with the internet because it had huge problems it was trying to solve. Public choice theory would not justify something like DARPA. They would just justify some upstream basic R&D spending and then wait for, you know, the VCs or other, you know, downstream investments to commercialize it. That is not what got us Silicon Valley. And the kind of corrupted public sector, which the public choice theorists are always telling us about, rises through that kind of framing. And that's why your whole point about culture and systemic change is needed. And that's why in the Institute, which is, you know, it's been sort of a headache to set up, it's not just about great new theory or great new policy ideas. It's very much at the training level. What does all this mean for literally the mindset, in the way that, you know, Che Guevara said, you need a new men, new women. It's not just about revolution.
It's lovely. Thank you so much, Mariana. We are aware that you have to go. Thank you so much for your contribution today.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. I'm sure you'll all stay on it, but you don't have to run with me.
Bye. So Alicia and Anis, so we just want to invite you to make, because we are approaching this, closing remarks, and we would like to have your comments on what do you think, how we can shift narratives from now, how we can change the way they actually talk about public services, public spending, the role of government, public-private partnership. We've heard that throughout the last 4 days. And we also been enlightened today by all of the keynote speakers' discussions. But what to move on? How can we persuade people to change the way they talk about public services, spending and provisions? Alicia?
Thank you so much, Jenny. And I found this conversation extremely, I would say, stimulating. Particularly Mariana is very much proposing things that are sounding, for example, in the case of Latin America and the Caribbean, she very rightly said that we need to redistribute, of course, but to create value. And that's where I think we have the main nut, let's say, the bolts of the matter, because in Latin America and the Caribbean, the private sector is about profit. They are not really thinking about they don't have this vision of how to create value in a new way, with innovative, with science, with technology, and of course this symbiotic relationship with the private and the public, I think is something that we need to work into and transform the institutions. I think there is a need for new institutional frameworks. We are trying to change without changing. Let's say, doing the same, how do we expect different results if we have the same institutions, the same people, the same rules of the game? So we really need to rethink profoundly. Chile is in that process, rethinking things profoundly with this new constitutional process. However, there are so much that the media is playing a very negative role in this process, I have to admit. Very negative. They are being totally in coalition with the elites, frankly, and just bombarding the new constitution and the new generation of people that have a different thinking and a different culture. So how to do this, I think, is something that we need to think. Maybe planning, maybe using instruments like public procurement, I think that's fine. How to, I would say, how to the participatory process. I think that's a very important thing. How to engage people from the start, citizens from the very start, how to be close with the people. And this is what Mexico is doing. The president is close to the people. He's not so transformative, I must say, in his own thinking, but this mission-oriented approach, the creation of value, the participatory approach, I think, and the changing of the institutions and the capabilities are at the center. So thank you so much, David, Jenny, for offering me this space and for being part of this magnificent event and initiative, because we have to continue rethinking economics and rethinking public expenditure. I think this is the core of the matter and the role of the state. So thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you, Alicia. I just want to say that we also see that the young voices are really important in this transformation. To follow after these closing remarks, we will have discussions and open discussions and presentations from the young scholars and activists. So for Anis, we would like to hear from you. What do you think, how we can shift narratives now?
Yeah. Well, Alicia actually said very eloquently that the media's role, this is part of the inequality that we have created over the last 40 years. Now they have captured almost every space. So how do we create the alternative narratives, that the initiative that you guys have taken, this is the way to go, actually, very forcefully, I would say. And they have created also narratives like, we are talking about creating value. In the discourse, whenever there is a conflict between labor and the capital comes, and say, for example, whenever you are asked for higher taxes, the reply comes, well, you don't tax the value creator. So you now call the capitalist or the owner of the capital as value creator. So this is a terminology being used. By default, the labor is a value destroyer. So it's a binary kind of narratives. It has been created. I give you another example. I think the Swiss Credit Suisse or one of those wealth report use the terminology called inclusive inequality. Now, when you see the World Economic Forum talking about inequality, they are basically capturing the debate, discourse, and then slowly introducing a terminology called inclusive inequality. Have you heard about this? Now, what is inclusive inequality? They say, well, inequality increased, but we have made the access to wealth to become millionaires easier. And how? That in the process, we have created a large middle class. So we have actually included a lot of people from the bottom to the middle class. And so it becomes the inequality is not bad as long as it is inclusive inequality. So you can see how they are changing the narrative. Then even the word level playing field, on the surface of it, you can't actually disagree with the level playing field unless you actually explain what it is. I still remember when I was in ASCAP, somebody from the OECD presenting a paper on creating level playing field in the trade. And I asked him the question. He didn't realize what I was getting at. I said, assume they organize a soccer game competition between a Cambodian team and an European soccer team. What will happen? He said, well, the Cambodian team will be decimated. It can be predicted. I said, then why you need level playing field? I would like a field which will be uphill for the European soccer team. So this is the kind of narratives they are creating, and the terminology, we have to be very careful. The terminology being used are not neutral. They are politically they are actually politically motivated terminology, but comes as if they are neutral terminology. Unfortunately, the universities, the colleges nowadays have become very monolithic in terms of what they are teaching. You don't see history of economic thought being taught in any of the universities nowadays. There is no course called public economics. Even public finance is not taught in many of the universities. It's gone. You are teaching corporate finance, you are teaching international finance, you are teaching banking, but there is no course called public finance or public economics. And there is no, the history of economic thought has disappeared as you emphasize more on modeling kind of courses. So I think we have to start from what we are doing now, the more of these discussions, and invite the younger generations to these kind of things, not the people like ourselves who are on the marching, out and whatever we can leave behind and still this kind of progressive thinking. I think is wonderful. This I congratulate the organizers for organizing this very thought-provoking conference, and even the title, Changing Narratives, is wonderful. It's very innovative. I think we should continue to do that. Again, once again, thanks and having me to this discussions. Thanks.
Thank you, Anis. I would like to say that your legacy will live on, and I'm sure it will. So at least for this conference, we've heard and we learned so much from you both and from all the other speakers. One of the key outcome of this conference is, first of all, it is the start of creating a network of the people who think alike and who dare to actually change the current narratives. The second thing is we hope to produce the conference report where we will try to sum up the rich content throughout the last 4 days. We'll be able to share it publicly, and we will try to continue with the work and follow up with all the speakers and also the people interested in this field. So I hope that also the academic output will be able to publish and get more attention, not just in academia, but also getting more, will become more helpful and impactful for the civil societies and the organizations. So I would like to thank you all, but also want Dave Hall, Professor Dave Hall, to say the final farewell to everyone for the conference. Thank you.
Okay. Well, Jenny says, is there a way of removing that echo? I don't know. Can you hear me all right now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. Really, thanks to everybody who's participated, everybody who participated in creating the conference. As Jenny said earlier in the day, we didn't really anticipate it to be this size, but it's been carried through on the enthusiasm of almost literally everybody we've dealt with, from academics, unions and social movements. And so in that sense, the simple existence of the conference and the fact it's happened and the feedback generally has been positive is already a first step in achieving one of the objectives of the conference. So thank you all for contributing to making it happen, and obviously in particular the speakers. And that's really the main thing. I mean, we've felt humbled, I think is one word, at just how much information, thinking, activity, willingness to discuss, willing to learn and willing to act and willing to attempt to collaborate to shift narratives further is out there. And so as Jenny says, we'll be having meetings obviously to discuss exactly what to do next, but we're pretty confident we will aim to try and continue the momentum that's happened here. So thanks very much, and have a good rest of the day, and we'll keep posting information about what happens next and any publications. So thanks from all of us, from me, from Jenny, Vera is here, I know, Tianyi, Nadja, all the organizing team. Thanks very much indeed. And we will see you all again soon, one place or another. Thank you.